Welcome to Seed World's Strategy Webinar. What's up with weed resistance and management strategies to help? My name is Julie Deering. I serve as the editor of Seed World, and today I'll be your moderator. I've got a few housekeeping items to make note of. For those of you who are on social media, we will be using the hashtag strategy webinar, so you can follow the conversation there. I'd like to give a special thank you to our sponsors, BASF and Syngenta, for their support. And a big thank you to our speakers for joining us today to share their knowledge and expertise on this important issue. Today, we'll be hearing from Bill Johnson of Purdue University, Dane Bowers of Syngenta, Andy Kendig of ADAMA, and Diane Plewa of the University of Illinois Plant Clinic. And here's our program for today. First, we're going to hear from Bill Johnson, and he's going to provide an overview of what the experts are seeing on the ground and where resistant weeds are most prominent. Then we're going to go into a roundtable discussion where Dane and Andy will join us. At that time, if you have any questions, please go ahead and type them into the chat box. And we will wrap up our presentation with Diane Plewa on weed resistance testing and molecular weed ID, and then have a final Q&A at the very end. So let's go ahead and dive on in. Our first speaker, as I said earlier, is Bill Johnson. He serves as the Purdue Extension weed specialist. Since 2002, Johnson has been helping Indiana's farmers better manage weed populations. Through his research and extension work, he's helped develop weed management systems that are economically and environmentally sound and integrate cultural practices with judicious herbicide use. Additionally, he strives to improve efficiency of production and minimize selection pressure for herbicide-resistant weeds. Before joining Purdue, Johnson served as an assistant professor of weed science at the University of Missouri from 1995 to 2002, and before that was a research scientist at Land O'Lakes. He earned his master's and doctorate from the University of Arkansas at Fayetteville and his bachelor's degree from Western Illinois University. Bill, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Julie. I'm certainly looking forward to this opportunity to participate in this educational event today. And basically what I want to do is kind of go through the scenario that we're currently faced with regards to herbicide-resistant weeds. And so I've got a couple of slides here that I want to show to people that kind of starts off with more of a 30,000-foot view, and then eventually what we're going to do is we're going to drill this down and look at, particularly one species that tends to be a driver weed for corn and soybean and cotton producers throughout most of those regions in the U.S. that grow these crops. So if we take a look at this slide here, this shows the number of herbicide-resistant weed species for several different sites of action dating up to about 1996. And what you can see here is that our triazine-resistant weeds, our PS2 inhibitors, the blue line, we started to see a very rapid increase in the number of weeds that were resistant to these herbicides starting in about 1975. If we move over a little bit to the right, we can see that several other herbicide family sites of action started to evolve resistant weed populations as well, with the red line showing what was happening with ALS inhibitor resistant weeds starting in about 1985. Now, if we go to the next slide, the reason we stopped this slide in 1996 is because when we got to 1996, Roundup Ready crops, particularly Roundup Ready soybean, was introduced. It solved a lot of the herbicide-resistant weed problems, particularly triazine and ALS inhibitor-resistant weed problems that were becoming so widespread at that time, and offered us a very simple, economical solution to controlling weeds. And it allowed us to expand our acreages because we could simply spray Roundup as often as we wanted to and get acceptable control by the end of the year. It facilitated rapid adoption of no-till practices as well, so that also allowed our farm sizes to get relatively large. Now, much like any technology, though, when something is simple and easy, it's adopted very rapidly, it's used and abused, and eventually you start to develop chinks in the armor. So if we go to slide number 10 then, what we can see is the rest of the graph from 1996 on. And what you can see there, with the red line, we still continued to document additional cases of ALS-resistant weeds, and that line essentially went straight up from about 1985 till about 2005. The triazine-resistant weed, the PS2 inhibitor-resistant weed line, the blue line at the top there, started to level off just a little bit as we migrated away, particularly from using Syncor in soybeans. We were still using quite a bit of atrazine in corn, but we started to really reduce our reliance on Syncor in soybeans. But if you look at some of the other families down below, the ACCase inhibitors, the green line, and particularly the lighter blue line, the glyphosate line, started to increase pretty rapidly. So herbicide-resistant weeds continued to evolve, and the reason they continued to evolve was the fact that we had largely decreased the use of tillage, particularly in soybean, but we also started to decrease the use of tillage in cotton and corn as well. And so our weed control programs became, predominated by the use of herbicides. And so herbicides are just like using an antibiotic. If you use it and you overuse it, you're going to select for the individuals that can survive the poison, so to speak, and eventually you have widespread instances of resistant populations that develop. So that's what the current global situation looks like. Now what I want to do is focus a little bit more on a weed that tends to drive a lot of decisions. And if we go to slide number 11, what we can see here, or what is the start here, is showing the progression of Palmer amaranth and water hemp, particularly glyphosate-resistant biotypes in the U.S. And so I'm going to go to slide number 12, and you can see that in 2005, we had water hemp in Missouri, we had Palmer amaranth in North Carolina and Georgia. If we go to the next slide, 2006, we have a couple more states, Illinois, Kansas, and Texas, where we have glyphosate-resistant water hemp, and then the Palmers becoming much more widespread in the Mid-South region with detections in Arkansas, Tennessee, and South Carolina. If we go to 2007, we're adding more states in the upper Midwest, Minnesota with water hemp. New Mexico is added to the Palmer amaranth detections, and if we go to 2008, we add Ohio to glyphosate-resistant water hemp map. And finally, as we kind of migrate through here, you can see that we're adding more and more states to the Palmer and the water hemp detections in each succeeding year until we get to 2013. In 2013 now, there are many states in kind of the middle part of the Corn Belt or the upper part of the Mid-South region that where we have both glyphosate-resistant Palmer and water hemp. And as I mentioned earlier, we do have a couple of resistant. These two weeds in particular really drive the decision-making process as far as, how are we going to control weeds in a specific cropping system. So I'm going to fast forward ahead now to slide number 23 because hopefully what I've kind of done here is made my point that that the progression of resistance in those two weeds in particular has been rapid. It's been game changers for producers in the Midwest and the Mid-South region, and it has basically taken weed control expenses from probably $10 to $20 an acre to over $50 an acre. So we've seen a very rapid increase in the cost of weed control as well. Now, if we take a look at slide number 23, we kind of talk about eras when we talk about different things throughout history. And what I like to talk about now in terms of the weed science discipline is we are in what we call the herbicide-resistant weed era. If you could go back 10 years ago and you could make the argument that we were in the Roundup Ready area. And really what this really refers to is what is the topic of conversation, whether it's between professionals that do weed control work for a living, or whether it's scientific conferences, or whether it's the questions that we're getting from farmers and practitioners. But this easily dominates our conversation and has been that way for at least 5 years. So if we go to slide number 24, not only do we have the pigweed species that have resistance to glyphosate, which is kind of a big deal, but we also have a number of weeds now that have developed or evolved resistance to more than one site of action or more than one herbicide. And what this graphic shows you here is it shows you the number of weed species that have evolved resistance to two or more sites of action. And what you can see here is this slide is actually a couple years old as well, but we do have water hemp populations now that have evolved resistance to 6 different sites of action. And so in some cropping systems, you essentially have no post-emerge tools for controlling water hemp. We have many weeds like ragweed, Palmer amaranth, common ragweed, and even a couple of grass species that have evolved a resistance to 2 modes of action. And that's problematic enough. But the thing is, when we are evolving resistance to more than one site of action, what that really means is we are down to maybe 1 or 2 tools that we can use to control that weed. And so what's likely to happen in the very near future is that we're going to have, we're basically going to run out of tools for control of that weed in that particular cropping system. And that will happen very fast because the selection pressure imposed upon that weed population by the one side of action that's left is really carrying the bulk of the burden. So I think what I want to do here is finish off with kind of an explanation of what I see as our driver weeds before we get into the next segment here. So I polled a few of my colleagues and I polled the other people I'm sharing the presentation with here today. And I said, if you had to think a little bit about what drives decision-making on the areas that you service or that you're aware of, for the Corn Belt region, water hemp is a clear number 1. Mare's tail is quickly catching up to it. It's kind of amazing to me to see how quickly that weed has become a major driver throughout most of the upper Midwest. Giant ragweed, Palmer, and kochia are a little bit more region-specific, but certainly driving decision-making on a lot of acres. In the Mid-South region, one person joked, well, you could list Palmer as 1, 2, and 3, and that would probably be accurate. But certainly Palmer drives decision-making processes, and many of us have heard about the stories about cotton fields being mowed down because of bad Palmer amaranth infestations. Because of high levels of adoption of no-till practices in the South and in the Midwest, mare's tail is a driver in both regions. But I think one of the unique things about the southern U.S. is they are experiencing some very severe issues with grass weeds, particularly Italian ryegrass, Johnson grass, and now we've documented some glyphosate-resistant barnyard grass as well. So slight differences between the 2 areas, but again, notice in the southern U.S. that the problems that they're having with grasses, and I think I kind of look at the southern U.S. as what's going to happen eventually in the Midwest, because the problems will tend to happen down there a year or 2 before they hit the upper Midwest. And so I think what I'm going to do then is kind of finish off with this final slide here, slide number 26, and really try to drive home the point about herbicide resistance in the pigweed species and how problematic that can be, and the fact that we really need to get on top of these weeds, or these weeds are going to be like soybean rust is to producers in Brazil and in Argentina, and essentially these weeds could really drive us to different cropping systems. So in the case of Palmer amaranth, we have 47 different cases of herbicide resistance reported in the U.S. We have resistance reported to 6 different sites of action, 17 cases of multiple resistance, and 27 states total that have some kind of a resistant weed population. With water hemp, again, we have resistance reported to 6 different sites of action. We have 15 cases of multiple site of action resistance, and we have some kind of resistance reported in 18 states. So again, hopefully that, what that does is kind of drive home the point that, as we start thinking about some of our worst weed problems and where our systems can go and what we need to be managing against, that, the amaranths are clearly at the top of the list, but we also need to be aware of things like the ragweeds and some of the grass weeds as well that can become extremely problematic. And so that's kind of the end of the information that I was going to present. So, Julie, I think I'll turn this back over to you.
Thanks, Bill. That's a great overview and certainly helps to set the stage in terms of priorities and what we need to be paying attention to. Now we're going to go ahead and move into our roundtable discussion, and Dane and Andy will join us for that. I'm going to quickly introduce the 2 of them. And as I'm doing that, if you have questions for our panel, please go ahead and type those into the chat box, and I will make sure that they have a chance to answer them. So Dane Bowers is Syngenta's technical product lead for herbicides. He's been employed with Syngenta and its legacy companies for more than 30 years, where he has helped growers fight herbicide resistance in multiple capacities. From field scientist to sales rep to his current role, Bowers' technical expertise, extensive field experience with retailers and growers, and passion have helped drive Syngenta's continued commitment to herbicide resistance management. He earned his bachelor's degree in soil and crop science and his master's degree in weed science, both from Purdue University. He is a member of the North Central Weed Science Society of America, and is a Syngenta representative on the U.S. Herbicide Resistant Action Committee. He has worked for Syngenta in Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, and now North Carolina. And then we have Andy, and Andy serves as herbicide development leader for ADAMA. He worked 15 years at the University of Missouri's Delta Center with weed control issues on rice, cotton, soybeans, corn, and wheat, including resistance management in soybean, cotton, and rice. Andy spent 7 years at Monsanto with dicamba cotton and dicamba formulations. And recently, he has been doing herbicide development and technical service with Chemnova, UPI, and ADAMA, where he currently supports cotton, rice, and Midwest herbicides. So Dane and Andy, thank you for joining the conversation. So I'm going to go ahead and kick things off. First, I'm going to go to Dane and just ask for kind of a simple explanation as to a piece of your bio. Can you tell me a little bit about the U.S. Herbicide Resistance Action Committee and what the committee is doing?
Yeah, certainly. I appreciate being on here this afternoon. Thanks for asking me to join. Herbicide Resistance Action Committee, it's a group of scientists that represent industry, and so we get together and we discuss strategies and also policy from an EPA perspective, and try to help us formulate good policy that's going to help us manage resistance, and also as companies, so we share information so that we can try to make the right recommendations with various active ingredients to maintain the sustainability of the active ingredients that we currently have.
I imagine that's a pretty active committee right now. What are some of the things that you're seeing and pieces that might be of concern?
Yeah, so just in general, I think Bill really set the table there around the resistance issues that we have. Certainly, all of the species that Bill mentioned are concerns. There's probably some concerns with other active ingredients. One of the things that we've been concerned from, I think, a Herbicide Resistance Action Committee perspective is that there are certain policies that perhaps have been put into place from various policy groups that actually may create difficulties in helping us to manage weeds. So, as an example, with that, with the conditions of registration for the dicamba products currently in soybeans, there are some limitations and it's difficult to get some of the tank mix products that we'd like to be able to utilize with dicamba, which are very important for us to maintain the sustainability of dicamba. Well, because of some of the regulations put in place, it makes it difficult to do the tank mixtures that we would like. So, some of the things we're trying to do there would be influence policy, so we can help folks understand, and the policymakers help them understand what we need to do to maintain the viability of these active ingredients.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the explanation. I'm going to kind of take us backwards a little bit, and from just a very kind of novice standpoint, Andy, can you explain to me why is it important that we pay attention to weed resistance and management, and why growers really need to be watching this and aware of it? Not only that.
Right. If you actually think about weeds and agriculture, it's almost as if we're at war with Mother Nature. All a weed wants is a little sunlight, water, and nutrients, and that's basically what we want for our crops. And when the grower's trying to grow a good corn crop, good soybean crop, he's fertilizing, and these are all things that help weeds grow. Unfortunately, Mother Nature is resilient, and we see resistance in drugs that we take for diseases. We see resistance in insecticides. We see this with weeds, and the grower wants to use products that work and wants to use products that are economical, and unfortunately, Mother Nature eventually tends to work herself around our efforts to control problems like weeds.
And Bill, you know, when you're out talking with growers and giving presentations and somebody walks up to you and says, you know, I know it's important, but I just, you know, I'm not quite sure I can implement some of these strategies on my farm, you know, what's your advice to them?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's always a difficult discussion to have when commodity prices are low. And, you know, the big thing I try to get my guys over here to look at is, are you starting to see subtle changes? Do you have a specific herbicide that doesn't appear to be working quite as well? And so what I try to impress upon them then is the fact that you have a resistant weed population that's developing or that's evolving, and now's the time to make the change. And the change doesn't have to be too terribly dramatic, but I try to get them to think about, you know, if you have you know, weed problems like mare's tail, like water hemp, like giant ragweed or something like that, try to make sure you're going after that weed with at least 2 active sites of action. And I think many times we fall into the trap that once we start controlling the weed with one herbicide, we just add one additional herbicide. And so the challenge with that becomes you're still only going after that weed with one side of action. So we got to get these guys thinking about going after their worst weed problems with at least 2 sites of action.
Gotcha. Dane, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think that's well said, Bill. And one of the things that when I talk with growers, oftentimes is that there are, as Bill said, small tweaks that can be made. You may not necessarily have to spend a lot more money. It could be things like making applications to smaller weeds. Can you hear me now? I apologize, my phone broke up. So
that's okay.
In some
I
cases,
hear you
it may
just fine.
So in some cases, it may be that you can just make applications of smaller weeds. It may be that if the herbicides you're using have some residual activity, think about applying those early to kill small weeds and take advantage of the residual activity of those herbicides. So perhaps you're not spending any more money, you're just applying the same herbicide at a different timing. So in some cases, those are some of the things we can do. And one of the things that we need to really consider as much as possible is how we need to think about controlling the weeds before they emerge rather than always depending upon the post-emergence application. So wherever possible, where we can use a really good residual material, overlap it with another residual material to prevent these weeds from emerging, the better off we're going to be, because we know that we tend to select for resistance faster just from use of post-emergence or depending too much on post-emergence herbicides.
Okay, now I'm going to ask each of you this question, and so Dane, I will start with you. You know, can you pretend like I'm a grower, and you know, what 5 pieces of advice or what 5 steps do I need to take to ensure that I've got the right integrated pest management strategy in place for controlling herbicide-resistant weeds?
Well, you're only going to limit me to 5, so that's probably a good thing because we could talk about this for an hour. But to try to boil it down, I think we always talk about starting clean, meaning we don't want to plant a crop into a field that is weedy, so we need to make sure we use a burn-down herbicide or tillage. And since I mentioned tillage, one of the things we need to think about is adding diversity to our weed management programs. We are in a scenario, as Bill mentioned earlier, that we depend only on herbicides for weed control, so we need to take advantage of things like cover crops, tillage, cultivation, in-crop, a lot of different things, narrow rows, and all those kinds of things that we can do to make the crop more competitive and try to take out the weeds with something besides. And then I think the other thing that I would think about is, as Bill said, always apply multiple sites of action wherever possible. So we want to apply more than one effective mode of action, whether it's pre or whether it's post. I think that's really critical, and try to prevent weeds from going to seed. And there's probably many other things I could mention, but those are just a handful of things that come to mind pretty quickly.
Thanks, Dane. Andy, I'll let you go next and add to it.
Thanks, and this is very unfair to Bill because Dane's already stolen a couple things I would want to say. You know, cultural weed control is very important, and we tend to underestimate how important that is, and that is the T word, tillage, and potentially cover crops. Obviously, you want to rotate chemical modes of action, spray things properly. I also like to simplify that maybe it needs to be a pre-emergence treatment of a grass and a broadleaf herbicide, and then a post-emergence treatment of a grass and a broadleaf herbicide. The other things I want to add in, sanitation is so very important these days. It's, you know, there's numerous examples of weeds becoming infested and the weeds coming up in streaks where the combine spit the trash out the back. If you discover a new weed problem on your farm, potentially even a resistant weed problem, you do have the opportunity in some cases to clean that up if you jump on it quickly. And the other thing I'll throw in is, you know, scouting is important. I think something we're all struggling with these days. How do you detect resistance when it occurs? Unfortunately, and I think it happens to the best of us, you know, you wake up one day and you have a field that's infested with a resistant weed population. When did that happen? When did it start, and how do we detect things sooner? Do what you have to do is another summary statement, and that could be some difficult things, including, you know, cultivating between rows again.
Thanks, Andy, and as Bill, as Andy said, I think you do have the difficult job here, but can you add any additional steps that a grower might want to take as they look to, you know, if they're starting at ground zero and say, you know I need to take action, you know, what can you tell them?
Well, I think Andy and Dane hit on a lot of the key points. One additional point that I try to make with the people that I talk to is, you know, many times, especially in the winter months, I'll get a phone call and people are considering their weed control program, and they know they need to make some changes, and so they're, you know, we tell them to call around and ask for advice. Talk to your retailer, talk to a crop advisor, talk to people you trust. And so, you know, when those phone calls come into me, the first thing that comes out of my mouth is, well, what weeds are we dealing with? And so I think it's imperative that the grower knows that each field can be a unique set of circumstances. It can have a unique population of weeds, but they really need to know what their worst targets are in each individual field. And I think, you know, we get, because Roundup made life so easy, we get lulled into this false sense of thinking that we can do the same weed control program on every farm or on every acre. And quite frankly, if we had the ability to customize weed control programs a little bit more for each field, if we either had the ability to do it because of knowledge, or we had the capability of doing it, I think a lot of our weed control problems would be a little bit less. So I think that's a key one. I also want to kind of capitalize on Andy's comment about sanitation. Many of the states now, because of some contaminated conservation planting seed, many states now are revising their seed laws, and I think even if your state doesn't revise its seed law, I would make sure that if you're planting a conservation crop of some sort or a cover crop of some sort, make sure you're getting clean seed. And if your seed supplier can't or won't guarantee that you're getting clean seed, shop around. I mean, we need to put some pressure back on that seed industry to make sure we're not spreading things around, because there's been some widespread instances of things like palmer and certainly annual ryegrass that have gotten spread around because of contaminated conservation plantings. So I think those are kind of two things that I would add to, or one thing that I would add to the things that Andy and Dane brought up. But you know, again, it still gets back to, you know, the way you're going to make that the best decision for whatever it is you do is knowledge. And so knowledge of the weed problems, knowledge of what's there, and being able to customize a program for those individual fields is a key component.
Thanks, Bill. And you kind of led me to one of my next questions, which is that, you know, taking into account each of the different weeds. And so I know you mentioned that palmer is a big problem, and then mare's tail, and how might management strategies differ between specifically those two weeds? So I'll let you kick us off there since you led us there.
Yep, good. Okay, good. Well, in terms of mare's tail, you know, mare's tail is a weed that we typically used to think of as being primarily a no-till weed, and if we could get rid of it by the time we got our crop up and going, we usually had that under control. And, you know, a lot of that is largely still true. If we can do something to basically keep that mare's tail from coming up uninhibited in our crop, or from being there when we plant our crop, mare's tail is not a very competitive plant, and just getting a crop canopy will do a great job of suppressing that one. The other thing about mare's tail is a lot of our cover crops that produce a lot of biomass will also provide mare's tail suppression. And I think if we think about acres to use cover crops on, so again, this gets back to customizing our weed control programs. Acres that have mare's tail on them, if you're going to get a weed control benefit out of a cover crop, acres that have mare's tail on them are a good target, and things that produce a lot of biomass like cereal rye can really help. Now, when we get into some of the summer annual weeds, you know, particularly things like palmer, there's been some mixed success in utilizing cover crops and things like that for palmer amaranth, but I think, you know, again, you've got to get some biomass produced, so you get some suppression early in the year, but you don't want to get too much biomass produced to where the residual herbicide that's also needed in that system is inhibited from getting to the soil. So the big thing with mare's tail is do as much damage to it as you can, either with herbicides, cover crops, or tillage, while your crop is not in the ground. So if you can get it controlled in the fall, if you need to follow up in the spring again, if you're in a more southern geography, just get on top of that stuff before your crop comes up. With a weed like palmer amaranth, which is more of a summer annual weed, you need to have an aggressive program with your residual herbicide, and then when you come back to do your post-emerge program, you need additional residual herbicides, plus you need to spray the palmer amaranth when it's small. The other consideration with palmer amaranth is if you have plants that escape your weed control programs, do not let them go to seed. I mean, that is a weed where one weed in a field is a threshold because of the volume of seed it can produce. And so having a no seed threshold or a no weed threshold with palmer amaranth is really going to be a strategy that's going to help out in the long run.
Thanks, Bill. Dan and Andy, do you have anything to add to that?
I'll just make a general comment that I wasn't going to make a specific recommendation for control of those two weeds, but this is like any difficult problem. There isn't one solution or one thing that we can throw out there and say this is what you do. It's usually a combination of factors, and that's why we're beginning to talk more and more about things like cover crops and tillage and using the herbicides correctly and the residual material. So it's going to take putting 3 or 4 of these practices together to be able to control some of these difficult resistant populations and prevent resistance from developing further.
I want to go off on a slightly strange tangent with the mare's tail situation, and I have gotten concerned sometime in the deep south where you have an extended warm winter, and you'll hear a recommendation for multiple herbicide applications through the winter. And I know there's soils that are difficult to work, and I know conservation tillage has great time benefits, but sometimes if you think that you're applying 3 herbicides to control wintertime weeds versus, you know, back in, it wasn't that many years ago, mid-1990s, in some areas where conventional tillage was used, there was no mare's tail problem because you were doing what Bill had described and destroying the horseweed shortly before planting with thorough tillage. And that's just one concern I have as we talk about herbicide resistance as a whole. Sometimes a tendency to put a lot of chemistry out there through the winter when we have the option of cold hard steel.
Thanks, Dane. Now, Dane, what do you say to growers who, just think that having resistant weeds in the field is inevitable and that it's just going part of evolution and a part of the cycle?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I've talked to folks in the past and get the feeling that we feel like it's just inevitable and there's nothing I can do about it, so why worry? But frankly, that couldn't be farther from the truth. The growers' practices and what you do on your farm is going to dictate how well you're going to be able to manage and prevent or delay development of resistance. It's so important. If you're using the right practices, the combination of things we've just talked about, you're going to limit the selection pressure in the weed populations you have in your field to prevent finding those rare resistant plants. And then if for whatever reason, Mother Nature or by mistake through a combine or a tillage tool or a bird flies over and drops some seed in your field that might be resistant, if you're doing the right practices, you're going to prevent establishment of these resistant weeds. So really the grower's practices is going to dictate. You have it in your control to manage weeds. I want everybody on the call today to not walk away thinking this is a problem we can't manage, because we can. I'm really confident that if we make the right decisions, get the right advice from the right people, that from your retailers, crop consultants, universities, industry folks, that we can manage resistance.
Thanks, Dane. Andy, Bill, do you have anything to add on to that?
I think Dane's right on the management aspect. When the glyphosate-resistant pigweed started becoming a problem, it seemed there was a 2 or 3 year period of weedy fields, and then things suddenly got cleaner. And I think attribute a lot of that to growers doing what they needed to do to manage those weeds, and just simply designing good, solid weed control programs.
Okay, and now, kind of, what I guess. We've got dicamba in the mix, and we've got a lot of states putting different policies forward from the Departments of Agriculture, and farmers uncertain about whether they should or shouldn't use it. And I know I'm getting into a little bit of a sensitive area here, but let's talk about what we've learned from years past, and maybe to keep that in mind as we move into the spring this year. So, Andy, I'll kind of let you kick us off there, if you don't mind.
We need modes of action, and Bill made the comment early on that of instances where we're down to a situation of only having one mode of action to control weeds. And herbicide use is something that's always been rather technical, and always read and follow label directions, and drift and off-target movement is not a new subject. It's been around for a long time. Recommendation and technology exists to deal with that sort of thing. I also will never forget a farmer who used to spray 2,4-D on corn next to cotton. That's a very, very sensitive situation. And the farmer told me his solution was to move over one row on his last pass through the field. And the wisdom of that really sunk into me about 5 minutes after he told me the story. He was doing everything that goes along with preventing drift, and I think just doing what we need to do are pretty much the answer to that.
Great, thank you. Bill, Dane, would you like to add to that?
Well, I'll say this from a resistance angle. I hope we've learned something from the pattern we've repeated in the past. So we started getting some PPO-resistant weeds, products like Flexstar, Blazer, Cobra, those kinds of things in the early 90s. Then we had glyphosate came in, glyphosate-resistant crops, and kind of rescued us. And then we started developing glyphosate resistance again, or glyphosate resistance. Then we leaned on the PPOs to control pigweeds. And now we've got PPO resistances building. So whatever tool you're using post-emergence, and if you're using only one product post-emergence, you really need to rethink that strategy. So whether it's, if it's dicamba, if it's glufosinate, a Liberty-type product, we need to put another mode of action into the tank wherever we can to try to prevent development of resistance. If we lean too much on one tool, bad things happen. We've repeated this over and over and over again, so I hope we're learning as we go forward, because we really are, as Andy said, we need these modes of action.
Yeah, this is Bill. I would agree with what both Andy and Dane said, and and it's a tough message to sell when commodity prices are low. But we really need to think about, as an industry, farmers, retailers, university people, industry, whoever it happens to be. We have to look at this as we have a finite set of tools in our toolbox. And the quote-unquote new tools that are coming to market right now are herbicide resistance traits to herbicides that we've already been using for quite some time. And so what can we do to help diversify what we do, whether we diversify from year to year or from field to field? We need to throw something different at the weeds in order to slow the development of resistance. And the worst habit to get into is just like Dane said, you take one product and you just rely on it until it breaks. Because once it breaks, there's no fixing it. There's no shop to take this thing to and fix it. And so the less that we can lean on some of these tools is going to increase their lifespan.
Gotcha. No, thank you very much. And I think in that we touched upon Steve's question, but I'll go ahead and ask it just if you have a more direct response or anything to add to it. How will the addition of dicamba resistance in crops impact resistance development as a whole? So Bill, I'll let you start.
Well, yeah, how will it impact resistance? Well, what it'll mean is that we will develop dicamba resistance more rapidly than we would have if we were just using it in corn. I mean, that's the simple answer, because if we fall into the same trap in soybeans that we did with Roundup Ready and that I see happening with Liberty Link, if we don't get weeds controlled with that first post-emerge spray, what happens way too often is we go back and respray with the same thing. And these resprays are what's going to get us in trouble. If we continue to do resprays and put that selection pressure out there, it's going to drive resistance much more rapidly, particularly on weeds that are already glyphosate resistant, because we're only spraying one mode of action on that resistant weed.
Thank you, Bill. We need to wrap up this part of our webinar, but Dane and Andy, do you have anything to add to Bill's response there?
I think Bill said it well.
That was great.
Okay, great. There we go. Last but certainly not least is Diane Plewa, who will talk about weed resistance testing and molecular weed ID. Plewa is the plant diagnostic outreach specialist at the University of Illinois Plant Clinic. Previously, she served as a horticulture educator for the University of Illinois Extension. She is responsible for the diagnosis of agricultural and ornamental plant samples received at the clinic and for overseeing various clinic services, including outreach and educational presentations about plant health concerns. Plewa collaborates with colleagues from the Illinois Department of Agriculture, State Department of Natural Resources, U.S. Department of Agriculture, and other universities and colleges. She earned her bachelor's in crop sciences from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and her master's in plant pathology from The Ohio State University. Diane, I'll let you take us home.
Okay, thank you, Julie, and thank you to everyone for joining us. So today I'm just going to give a brief overview about testing for herbicide resistance in Amaranthus species at the University of Illinois Plant Clinic and a little bit of information about the molecular identification service that we are also offering. So currently we have 2 tests that are offered. Both of these are molecular-based assays. The first is for glyphosate resistance, and it tests for increased copy number of a specific gene, the EPSPS gene. This increased copy number has been associated with reduced sensitivity to glyphosate herbicides, and we test for the relative amount of the EPSPS gene compared to a single copy gene in an individual plant, and then we compare that ratio to the ratio of from sensitive control plants. And so we score a sample as positive for the glyphosate resistance assay if the assay detects an elevated an elevated gene copy number for the EPSPS gene compared to those of the control plants. And preliminary survey work done by weed scientists at the University of Illinois showed that this was the most common mode of resistance in Illinois, but there are other mechanisms for resistance to glyphosate that we do not test for that may be more prevalent in other areas of the country, so that is something I want people to be aware of if they are considering using our service. The second assay is a different type of qPCR protocol. It's a PPO inhibitor assay test which tests for a specific mutation in the PPX2L gene, which confers resistance to the PPO inhibitor herbicides. And this is a dominant allele of the mutation which conveys resistance, so both homozygous dominant and heterozygous plants are scored as positive in this assay. And again, there are other mechanisms known to convey PPO inhibitor herbicide resistance. Currently, Dr. Pat Tranell's laboratory at the University of Illinois is running additional testing for these mutations, so if you're interested, you can contact me and I can give you additional information about that as well. And these assays have been validated for water hemp and for Palmer amaranth. Although we do not identify Amaranthus species that are submitted, so I would not be surprised if these assays also work for other related Amaranthus weed species. The assays are fairly specific, however, so they will not work on unrelated weed species such as mare's tail or lamb's quarters. We get requests for those multiple times a year, and if we're ever able to offer that service, I most certainly will. However, the assays are designed so that testing something like mare's tail results in an undetermined result as opposed to a false negative. And both of these assays test individual plants, but we ask for multiple plants from a field so that we can give a field result based on more of a field population as opposed to an individual plant population. And so the field result will either be positive or negative for each type of resistance that we test for. And I just wanted to take a quick moment to note that both of these assays that we use were developed in weed science labs at the U of I, and after being validated, the service was transitioned to the plant clinic. And because we are set up as a service lab, we can offer a fairly rapid turnaround time on the samples. We usually aim for under 2 weeks. Last summer, our average was around 5 to 10 days, depending on kind of where in the queue we were. But this allows for the research labs to continue their work, discovering new mechanisms of resistance and developing novel testing assays, which we can then hopefully offer as new services if there is that that value to the general public or to agronomic producers. So this has been a really nice collaboration, and we're hoping to continue this sort of collaboration with other labs. So in terms of looking at where we found resistance, so plants resistant to glyphosate with an increased copy number of the EPSPS gene were originally observed in populations from Illinois, Kansas, Missouri, and Nebraska in the original paper. And we have since confirmed this mechanism of action in Indiana, Iowa, Kentucky, Minnesota, Missouri, South Dakota, Tennessee, and Wisconsin. And the year shown after the state name is the year that we confirmed this resistance. As was mentioned earlier, resistance to glyphosate and also for the PPO inhibitor resistance has probably appeared much earlier in the state, so this is just based on our data from the samples that have been submitted to us. And then for the PPO inhibitor resistance, populations from Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Kansas, and Missouri tested positive when the original paper was published, and then Kentucky, Michigan, Minnesota, Nebraska, Ohio, South Dakota, Tennessee, and Wisconsin, again, have all tested positive at various years. And then looking at a 3-year summary, we've only been offering this service for the past 3 years, so we only have 3 years worth of data coming from the plant clinic. But this table kind of sums up the general trends we've observed since we started offering this service. The number of samples resistant to either class of herbicide has generally increased every year. But what I find much more concerning is this trend seen on the far right, where the number of fields resistant to both classes is increasing fairly rapidly. And we expect to see that trend continue. Both of the mechanisms that convey resistance that we're testing for are inherited in a dominant manner, so we expect to see resistance to persist in areas where it has developed, which is obviously of concern. We've tested over 1,200 fields, which equals approximately 4,800 plants from 13 different states, most of which have been in the Midwest. And so I'm just going to spend a couple slides going over how to submit a sample if you are interested, and then mention briefly the molecular weed identification survey that we also offer. So in terms of submitting a sample, we ask that you choose the top 2 to 5 inches of healthy tissue from plants that have survived a herbicide application. If this is getting later in the season and the plants are producing seed heads, so the top several inches of the plant is a seed head, I don't really need that seed head. What I need is fairly healthy looking, young, fresh growing leaves. So if you want to include a seed head, you can, but make sure there are at least some leaves included in that sample as well. The tests are performed on a field basis, and so we ask that you include 5 plants per field, and then we will test those plants to determine the overall field result. Place the plant samples into individual bags. We prefer that you put them in individual bags because that way I know that I'm testing individual plants, as opposed to if there's just a handful of plants shoved into one bag. I'm not sure if these were 3 different plants or 5 different plants or 12 different plants, and I want to make sure that when we're doing our testing that we are actually getting a population and not just testing multiples of the same plant. So ideally they're placed into individual bags, and those bags are labeled very clearly if you're submitting more than one field so that we don't accidentally combine samples. Please keep samples cool, but do not freeze them, and then ship early in the week to avoid kind of the weekend layover in a mail sorting facility, which may or may not be climate controlled, and include a sample submission form for each field. We have some additional information about the sort of testing available. It's on our website. The link is right there. We also have a sample submission form, which again is on our website, and you have the link. There is a $50 fee for a field test, which includes both the glyphosate and the PPO inhibitor herbicide resistance assays. And again, currently we are advertising it as for water hemp and water hemp and Palmer amaranth. However, it has been working fairly well on related amaranthus species. It does not work on mare's tail, lamb's quarter, some of the other big weeds that we're beginning to see show up that people are asking for, ragweed, things like that. Unfortunately, this assay will not work. And then we do also have a new service that we just started last year, molecular identification of Palmer amaranth in mixed seed samples. And this sample submission form is actually the same for both the herbicide resistance assay and also this molecular identification. So it's the same form. And this service, it allows us to test from 1 to 100 seeds at a time. The service has been fairly popular with seed producers and also regulatory agencies. What we ask is that you send us the amaranthus species seeds that you collect from a mixed seed sample. We are working in cooperation with Illinois Crop Improvement Association, so if you have just a mixed seed sample, we ask that you send it to them so that they can clean the sample, collect the potential amaranthus species seeds, and then those get sent to us. Last summer we had one student who was painstakingly picking out amaranthus species seeds from large mixed seed samples, and that was just not something that we could continue doing. So we ask that you submit just kind of amaranthus species seeds or seeds that are of that same kind of size and potential shape. And we are currently testing for Palmer amaranth. We are piloting a water hemp test as well, which so far our results have indicated we will be able to test for water hemp, but we want to make sure that we validate that. So again, if water hemp is of concern in a mixed seed sample, you can also contact me, and once we have that sample service validated, we'll be offering that. And then just finally, I have the plant clinic contact information. The first couple of lines, that's our mailing address. That's where samples could be submitted to. You have our phone number and then our email address, that plantclinic@illinois.edu. It's monitored by a couple of people, but I'm the primary person, so if you need to get in contact with me, that's a good way to find me. And then you also have our website, which again has our sample submission forms and information about sampling. So again, if you have any questions about any of these services, I would be happy to answer them.
Great, thanks Diane. I believe we have a few minutes for a Q&A. These questions can be specific to Diane's presentation or addressed to any one of our speakers. So if you have questions, please go ahead and type those into the chat box at this time. The first question that came in, I believe Diane is referring to slide 30. So let me take you back there. And the question is, what percent of plants? 39, my apologies. And so I don't know if you know exactly what they're referencing.
So unfortunately, this data is based off of the assays that we're currently offering, which means that this is only based off of Amaranthus species. So in terms of plants in general or weed species in general, I unfortunately don't have data for that because these assays will not work on some of the other problematic weed species that we see in agronomic production. So what I can tell you is that, like in 2017, almost 2/3 of the fields that we tested positive for both glyphosate and PPO. They may also have been resistant to a number of other classes. We used to offer, well, we didn't, but another lab on campus used to offer an ALS inhibitor resistance assay, for example, and they stopped offering that because there was no further demand, because it's kind of assumed at this point that the plants are going to be resistant. So in terms of plants in general, I unfortunately don't have an answer for that. This data summary is based just on the Amaranthus species.
Thanks, Diane.
Dane, if I could jump in on that just a second. There's a really good lesson to be learned here, and that is when we lose the primary tool, then the next tool that we're leaning on, we tend to put the pressure on it, and then we start losing it. So in this case, it was glyphosate and then PPO. So the dominoes start to fall, and so that's why we have to be really careful of always using mixtures and effective mixtures where we don't have significant resistance at a given point in time. So I think there's a really good lesson to be learned from that slide.
Thank you for jumping in. I was just going to say, I think these numbers, really help to paint the picture. And so I was going to ask each of you, kind of what is your take on these numbers, and Bill and Dane and Andy specifically, and what does this tell you? Either confirming what you already know, or adding more to the picture.
Well, this is Bill. So as I look at the data generated by Illinois' clinic and compare that to the data generated by ours, I think we're finding similar numbers of glyphosate-resistant plants, but our percentage of plants that are resistant to PPOs was a little bit lower, but growing rapidly. Now, if I think about the history of water hemp in the state of Indiana compared to Illinois, our water hemp problems have escalated pretty rapidly recently, but I know in the state of Illinois and states further west, their water hemp issues started, over 15 years ago. So the problem is just still kind of in the, not really the infant, but more of a juvenile stage here. So what you can see from data like this is where Indiana would go if we didn't have some new things or newer things to basically throw at the weeds. And I think it would be interesting to track this over time, but if you look at, kind of to capitalize on Dane's point, if you look at the percentage of plants that were resistant to glyphosate and to PPOs and how rapidly that's growing, in a weed like water hemp that produces so much seed, once that percentage is above about 1 or 2%, you've got a problem, and you need to make substantial changes to your field because of the seed production. And so, I think the important message here is that in straight Roundup Ready 2s, which were 95% or more of the soybean market just 3 years ago, we do not have post-emerge tools for this weed anymore. And so the thing that we have to be careful of is, are we going to drive the Extend technology, the Enlist technology, Liberty Link technology down that same pathway very rapidly if we don't change the herbicide use patterns?
Thanks, Bill. Andy or Dane, do you want to add to that?
I will just run back to, in addition to that, this is why we actually do need to seriously consider the cultural things, the sanitation, and, scouting and intimate awareness of what is going on in your field.
Great. Thank you. I believe we are bumping up against the 1 o'clock Central hour. And so I'm going to go ahead and wrap things up for today. I want to thank our speakers, Bill Johnson of Purdue, Dane Bowers of Syngenta, Andy Kendig of ADAMA, and Diane Plewa of the University of Illinois Plant Clinic for joining us today and making time in their busy schedules to participate. We hope that you found this information of value. And again, I want to thank our sponsors at BASF and Syngenta for their continued support and sponsorship of this strategy series. And so it is a series, so if you have a chance and are interested, we'll be hosting our next webinar April 3rd at noon Central. And the topic that we're going to hone in on is dust off from seed treatments, specifically keeping dust out of fields this spring and thus out of the headlines. So our registration is open for that at seedworld.com/webinar. So we hope you'll make plans to join us there. As a final wrap-up, this webinar has been recorded and will be made available on seedworld.com within 24 hours. So if there's anything you want to come back to, feel free to check us out there again. That's all we have for today. Thanks so much for joining us. This is Julie Deering signing off.